At 78 years old, Odette Farrow should have been sitting on her porch on Sycamore Lane, watching the dogwood trees she had planted with her own hands 30 years ago. Instead, a single legal document left her on the sidewalk with one suitcase, no money, and nowhere to go. But what Odette did next, walking alone through the iron gate of a sealed, abandoned mansion on the edge of Millhaven, Virginia, was only the beginning. Because what she found inside that house, behind a pantry wall that had not moved in decades, would force an entire town to reckon with what it had done to her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Odette Farrow had lived on Sycamore Lane for 46 years. She and her husband Leland had moved into the house in the spring of 1978, the week after their wedding, carrying furniture up the front steps in the rain, while a neighbor they hadn't yet met brought them coffee and laughed at the chaos of it all. The house was a cream-colored colonial with dark green shutters, a deep front porch, and a backyard large enough for a vegetable garden that Odette would tend every year until the autumn she turned 76, and her knees finally told her they were done with kneeling in dirt. Leland died 3 years ago. A stroke on a Tuesday morning, quick, without warning, which was the kind of death people said was merciful and which Odette understood intellectually even when it felt like anything. But he had been eating toast. She had been in the next room, folding laundry. By the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing left to do but call their son, and then call their son again when he didn't answer, and then sit in the kitchen with a neighbor holding her hand while the house filled with a silence she had never heard before in 43 years of marriage. Their son, Nolan, had always been difficult in the way that certain people are difficult. Not cruel exactly, not consistently, but capable of cruelty when it served him and skilled at disguising it as concern. He had Leland's face and none of Leland's steadiness. After his father's death, he began visiting more often, and Odette, who was lonely and grieving, welcomed him. She cooked his favorite meals. She listened to his problems. She did not yet know he was measuring the house with his eyes every time he walked through it. The house on Sycamore Lane was worth $380,000. Modest by some measures, significant in Millhaven, where property values had climbed steadily through the previous decade as people from Richmond and Washington discovered the town's quiet streets and good schools. Odette had no mortgage. She and Leland had paid it off in 2009. She had a small pension from 30 years of work as a school librarian, a modest savings account, and the house. Those were the sum of her material assets. They were also, she would later understand, exactly what Nolan needed. 6 months after Leland's funeral, Nolan came to Sycamore Lane with papers. He sat at the kitchen table in the chair his father had always used, and Odette noticed that and said nothing about it. He had a leather folder with him. He opened it with the deliberate care of someone who had rehearsed this moment, and he began explaining, in the patient voice of a man addressing someone he considered slow, that he had been speaking with a financial advisor about Odette's situation. She was alone now. She was getting older. Managing a house this size on a pension was not practical. What if she fell? What if her memory began to slip? What if something happened and there was no one there to handle paperwork? He placed a document in front of her. Power of attorney, he said. Just a safety net. Just so he could help with decisions if she wasn't able to. His father would have wanted him to take care of her. Odette looked at the papers for a long time. The legal language ran together in ways she couldn't parse. Clauses inside clauses, conditions folded into conditions. She asked Nolan what it meant, specifically, and he told her it meant he could help her with finances and property decisions if she was unable to. A safety net, he said again. That was all. She signed it. She signed it because she was 78 years old and she had buried her husband 8 months before, and her son was sitting in Leland's chair telling her this was what Leland would have wanted. She signed it because loneliness makes people trust things they would otherwise examine more carefully. She signed it because she had no way of knowing that the son she had raised and fed and loved and worried over for 51 years had already, before he sat down at that table, identified a buyer for the house. The notice came from a real estate company 11 weeks later. Odette read it 3 times at the kitchen counter before she accepted that it was real. The house had been sold. She was being given 30 days to vacate the property. She called Nolan immediately, her hands shaking so badly she misdialed twice before she reached him. He answered on the fourth ring, and his voice when he heard her was not the voice of someone surprised. It was the voice of someone who had been waiting for this call and had decided in advance how to handle it. He told her they had discussed this. He told her she had agreed that the house was too much for her. He told her that the power of attorney gave him the legal authority to make this decision, and that he had made it, and that the money from the sale would cover his debts and her transition to an assisted living facility. He said he was sorry. He did not sound sorry. When she told him she had nowhere to go, he said she would figure it out. And then he said he had to go, and then he hung up. Odette stood in her kitchen with the phone still in her hand. Outside the window, the dogwood trees she had planted were bare in the November cold, their branches the color of old bone against a white sky. The kitchen smelled of the coffee she had made that morning, and the soap she had used to wash the mugs afterward, and faintly of the cedar she kept in the linen drawers. These were the smells of her house, which was no longer her house, which had been sold without her knowledge to pay for a debt she had never incurred. She called a lawyer the next morning. The lawyer told her what she already feared. The sale was legal. Nolan had acted within the scope of the power of attorney. Challenging it would require evidence of fraud or a formal finding of mental incompetence at the time of signing, and both were expensive, slow, and uncertain. The 30 days would pass before anything could be done. The 30 days passed like a fever. She packed what she could. She called the people she had known for decades, and most of them were kind but had no room or were themselves in situations too precarious to absorb another person's crisis. She looked into assisted living and found that the facilities worth living in had waiting lists measured in months and deposits she no longer had. The county shelter had a bed, but Odette could not make herself go there, could not reconcile who she was with what that would mean. On the morning of the eviction, a Tuesday in early November, Odette stood on the sidewalk outside the house she had lived in for 46 years and watched two men board up the front windows. A woman from 3 doors down, Cecilia Marsh, came out and pressed a folded envelope into Odette's hand. $300, Cecilia said. She was sorry. She wished she could do more. Odette thanked her and meant it. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked. She walked without a clear destination for the first 20 minutes, through streets she had known since before some of their current residents were born, past the library where she had worked for 3 decades, past the elementary school where she had read to children who were now middle-aged, past the church where Leland's funeral had been held. The cold was sharp. The suitcase pulled at her shoulder. She was 78 years old, and she was homeless, and the full weight of that fact was only beginning to settle. It was while she stood at the edge of town, at the corner where Millhaven's last street gave way to the county road, that she thought of Crane House. Most people in Millhaven knew Crane House the way you know a landmark you have never entered, by its silhouette. It sat at the end of a long gravel drive off Route 9, 3 stories of dark brick behind a cast-iron gate, half hidden by oaks that had been growing since before anyone currently living in Millhaven had been born. The house had been sealed for at least 30 years, possibly longer. No one in town seemed entirely sure who owned it or why it had been left to stand empty. There were stories, the way there are always stories about old houses, but Odette had never paid them much attention. What she knew, and what she had known since she was a young woman new to Millhaven, was that the house had belonged to the Crane family, and that the Cranes had been connected to the Farrows in some way she had never fully understood. Leland had mentioned it once, years ago, in passing, something about the family sharing a history before either of their parents were born. He had said it the way people say things they consider minor and then forget, and Odette had filed it away in the category of information that might one day matter and probably wouldn't. Standing at the edge of Millhaven with a suitcase and $300, she decided it mattered now. The walk to Crane House took her 40 minutes. The gravel drive was overgrown. The iron gate rusted open at an angle that suggested it had not fully closed in years. The house, seen up close for the first time, was larger than it appeared from the road. A broad 3-story colonial with tall windows, a wide front door set between columns, and a roofline broken by 2 chimneys that rose against the gray sky like old fingers. The brick was dark with age and weather. Several of the window shutters hung at angles. The front steps were cracked, weeds pushing through the gaps. But the structure was sound. Even standing in the driveway with cold wind moving through the oaks, Odette could see that. The walls were straight. The chimneys stood. The roof, for what she could tell, was intact. She stood in front of the door for a long moment. Then she tried the handle. It opened. The smell hit her first. 30 years of closed rooms had produced something dense and particular. Dust, yes, but underneath it's something older, the slow exhale of wood and plaster and fabric left to age without air or light. It was not the smell of rot exactly. The house had not collapsed into itself. It was more the smell of time, of a place that had been holding its breath for decades and had simply kept on holding it. Odette stood in the entrance hall and let her eyes adjust. The hall was wide, with a floor of dark hardwood that ran back toward a staircase at the far end. The staircase was broad, with a carved banister, the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to an earlier century and a level of care that no one bothered with anymore. To her left, a set of double doors stood slightly ajar. To her right, another door closed. Overhead, a chandelier hung from the plaster ceiling, its crystals filmed with dust so thick they had lost any suggestion of sparkle. Cobwebs connected it to the ceiling in 4 directions like gray rigging. Everything was still, not the stillness of a house between occupants, but the stillness of a house that had been deliberately stopped. She set her suitcase down by the door and walked to the double doors on her left. They opened into a sitting room, large, with 2 windows facing the front drive. The windows had been covered from the inside with heavy drapes, dark green wool, and almost no light came through. What she could see in the gray that filtered around the edges: a fireplace, a mantelpiece, 2 armchairs with their upholstery going gray with dust, a low table between them, a lamp that still held its shade. A book lay open on one of the chair arms, face down, as though someone had set it there meaning to come back. No one had come back. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She moved through the ground floor methodically, the way she had once moved through the library after closing, checking each room before locking up. A formal dining room with a table long enough for 12. A study with floor-to-ceiling shelves still holding their books, the spines faded to uniform brown and gray. A small bathroom with a clawfoot tub and a tap she tried without expectation. Nothing came out, which she had expected. A narrow room off the dining room that appeared to have been used as a pantry, its shelves still holding glass jars of preserves long past any safe use. Their lids rusted, their contents reduced to dark sediment. The kitchen was at the back of the house, larger than she had expected, with a wide stone hearth on the far wall and a cast-iron range that had not been a working stove in at least 50 years. 2 windows above the stone sink looked out onto an overgrown back garden where a stone path had disappeared almost entirely under decades of grass and vine. She ran the cold tap. After a long shuddering in the pipes, brown water came out, then cleared to something that looked, if not clean, at least like water. The pipes still worked. The house had not been fully disconnected from the county water line. Whether through oversight or intention, she couldn't tell. That single fact changed the calculation considerably. Odette went back to the entrance hall and retrieved her suitcase. She carried it upstairs, 1 step at a time, testing each tread before she put her weight on it. The staircase held. The landing at the top was wide, with 4 doors opening off it, and she tried each one. 3 bedrooms, the largest still holding an iron bed frame and a mattress she would not trust without inspection. A bathroom with plumbing that matched the kitchen, functional but uncertain. She chose the smallest bedroom at the back of the house for no reason she could have articulated except that its window looked out over the garden, and there was something about that view, even overgrown and dying back in the November cold, that felt less exposed than the rooms facing the road. She set her suitcase on the floor. She sat on the windowsill and looked out at the garden for a long time. She was a 78-year-old woman sitting in an abandoned house she had entered without permission, with $300 and a suitcase containing 4 changes of clothes, a photograph of Leland, her library card, and a wool blanket she had folded in at the last moment without knowing why. She had no plan beyond tonight, no plan beyond the next hour, if she was being honest. What she had, and what she held onto with both hands in that small back bedroom as the November light failed outside, was the same thing that had gotten her through 46 years of a life that had not always been gentle. She was still here. She was still upright. Whatever Nolan had taken from her, he had not taken that. She unfolded the blanket. She lay down on the dusty floor with her coat on and her suitcase under her head. She slept. She woke before dawn to the sound of wind moving through a gap somewhere in the upper floor, a low, uneven sound that took her a moment to place. For 3 or 4 seconds, she did not know where she was. Then she did, and the full reality of it settled back over her like something heavy being set down. She was cold. The coat had helped, but not enough, and the floor had pulled the warmth from her back through the night. She sat up slowly, working through the stiffness in her shoulders and hips, and sat with her knees drawn up in the dark until the gray light outside the window began to separate the garden from the sky. The first thing she did that morning was take stock. $300 for changes of clothes, 1 blanket, a bar of soap, and a small bottle of shampoo she had packed on instinct. 2 books she had grabbed from the shelf beside her bed on Sycamore Lane without looking at their titles. A box of crackers and a jar of peanut butter that she had put in the suitcase the night before the eviction, when she still didn't fully believe it was happening. Her reading glasses, Leland's photograph in its silver frame. She ate crackers sitting on the windowsill and looked out at the garden while the light came up. The garden was large, perhaps a 1/4 acre, walled on 3 sides by old brick. A stone path cut through the middle of it, mostly swallowed now by grass gone to seed, and along the far wall she could see the remains of raised beds, their wooden frames rotted to gray, their soil long since taken over by whatever had chosen to grow there without tending. An oak tree in the corner, enormous, older than the house almost certainly, still held most of its brown leaves in the November cold. It was beneath the neglect a good garden. The bones were there. She noted this the way she had always noted useful things, without sentiment, as a fact that might matter later. Then she went downstairs to figure out the kitchen. The cast-iron range was decorative at this point, but against the kitchen's far wall she found something more useful, a small electric 2-burner unit, the kind sold in hardware stores for use in hunting cabins, still plugged into the wall socket. She flipped the switch on the socket. Nothing. She checked the breaker box she found in a narrow closet off the kitchen, a gray metal panel with hand-labeled switches and faded pencil, and worked through them one by one until the kitchen light came on. A single bulb in a fixture above the sink, 40 watts at most, but light. The 2-burner unit glowed orange when she turned its knob. The electricity worked. She stood very still for a moment after that discovery, her hand still on the burner dial, and allowed herself something she had not allowed since the eviction notice arrived. Not hope exactly, which felt too large and too risky. Something smaller. The recognition that the situation was not only what she had feared it was, that there were facts here she had not anticipated, and that some of those facts were in her favor. She spent the rest of that first full day learning the house, not exploring it in any romantic sense, but studying it the way a practical woman studies a problem. She opened every door, tested every tap, checked every window latch. She mapped the drafts, which were significant on the upper floor, but manageable on the ground floor where the walls were thicker. She identified which rooms were driest and which held moisture in their corners. She found, in a closet off the study, a collection of candles still in their paper wrappers, 2 oil lanterns with half-full reservoirs, a hand torch with corroded batteries she set aside, and 3 wool blankets sealed in a cedar chest that smelled strongly of camphor but were otherwise intact. Someone had prepared for absences here. Long absences. The house had been stocked by someone who expected to be away and intended to return, and whoever that person was, they had never come back. She carried the blankets upstairs. She made something closer to a bed on the floor of the small back bedroom, using her coat as a base layer. She ate peanut butter on crackers for dinner and drank water from the kitchen tap, which had cleared considerably by evening. She lit one of the oil lanterns and set it on the windowsill and sat in its light with one of the two books she had grabbed from her shelf. It was a novel she had read before, years ago. She could not have said now what it was about. The words moved past her without sticking. What she was really doing, she knew, was sitting with the lantern and the house and the facts of her situation, turning them over in her mind, looking at them from each side the way you look at something you're trying to understand before you decide what to do with it. By the time she blew out the lantern, she had decided. She was staying. And if she was staying, she was going to make this place livable. Not comfortable in any conventional sense, not quickly, not easily, but livable. She had spent 30 years as a librarian, which meant she had spent 30 years solving problems with limited resources, and this was a problem with limited resources, and she was going to solve it. She pulled the blankets up and closed her eyes. The second week was harder than the first. The first week had the momentum of necessity behind it. The shock of the eviction was still fresh enough to override everything else, and the discoveries inside Crane House had given her enough small problems to solve that she hadn't had time to sit with the larger ones. By the second week, the shock had worn down to something duller and more persistent, and the house's problems had revealed themselves in their full scope. The ground floor rooms were manageable. The upper floor was not, at least not in winter. Cold air moved through the upper hallway with a steadiness that suggested more than one compromised window, and Odette, who had spent 2 nights fighting the draft from the bedroom door no matter how she wedged it, moved her sleeping arrangement down to the study on the ground floor. The study had a fireplace. The fireplace had a flue she tested carefully with a sheet of old newspaper before she trusted it, watching the smoke pull upward and away before she committed to a real fire. The wood was the first practical problem she solved. Behind the carriage house at the back of the property, half buried under years of fallen leaves and creeping vine, she found a cord of split oak stacked against the brick wall. Old wood, dry as chalk, which in a working fireplace was exactly what she needed. She moved it inside over the course of 2 days, carrying armload after armload through the back door and stacking it in the corner of the study, her arms aching by the end of each session and her hands going rough from the bark. She was 78 years old, doing the physical work of someone 40 years younger, and she did it without ceremony because there was no one to perform for her and because it needed doing. The fire on the third evening in the study was the first warm night she had. She sat close to it and ate the soup she had heated on the 2-burner unit, a can of vegetable broth she had bought on her first cautious trip into Millhaven 4 days after arriving. That trip had required planning. She knew people in this town. She had worked among them for 30 years. She could not walk into the grocery store on Main Street without being recognized, and being recognized meant questions she was not ready to answer, which meant she would have to explain where she was living, which meant the town would know within 48 hours. She went instead to the small convenience store on Route 9, a 20-minute walk from Crane House, run by a man named Otto, who had taken it over from his father and who mostly interacted with customers by sliding their purchases across the counter without looking up. She bought canned goods, bread, a box of tea, matches, batteries for the torch she had found, and a pair of heavy work gloves that she needed more than she wanted to admit. She paid in cash and walked back along the road's gravel shoulder with the bag over one arm. She made this trip twice a week, always early, always to Otto's store, always cash. The house itself was beginning to change under her attention. Not dramatically, not quickly, but the way things change when someone patient applies consistent work to them. She cleaned one room at a time, starting with the study and working outward. She took the drapes down from the sitting room windows and beat them in the back garden until the dust stopped rising, then rehung them. She cleared the dining room of the mouse evidence she had found along its baseboards and sealed the gap behind the wainscoting where they had been entering, using strips of fabric torn from a worn shirt and a tin of wood filler she found in the carriage house. She was making the house hers, not in any legal sense, not yet, but in the deeper sense that comes from knowing every room's particular cold spot, every door that needed lifting slightly to close properly, every window latch that required 2 hands. She knew where the oak tree's shadow fell in the afternoon and which corner of the kitchen caught the most morning light. She knew the sounds the house made at night, the particular sequence of creaks from the upper floor as the temperature dropped, the low sound from the chimney when the wind came from the northeast. These were the things you learned about a place by living in it. Not visiting, not inspecting, living. She had been at Crane House for 18 days when she noticed the pantry wall. She had been in the pantry dozens of times by then, clearing the rusted jars from its shelves, scrubbing the wooden boards, using the space to store her growing supply of canned goods in the organized rows that habit and 30 years of library work had made second nature to her. She knew the room. She thought she knew it completely. But on the 18th day, moving a shelf unit away from the back wall to clean behind it, her knuckles knocked against the plaster, and the sound it returned was not the sound of plaster over brick. It was hollow. She knocked again, in 3 different spots across the back wall of the pantry, moving her knuckles slowly from left to right at chest height. The left third of the wall returned the flat, dense sound of plaster over solid brick. She had heard that sound throughout the house for 18 days. She knew it the way you know a bass line, unnoticed until something interrupts it. The right 2/3 of the wall gave back something else entirely. A lighter sound, resonant, with a faint ring at its edges. Air behind it. Space. Odette stood back and looked at the wall properly for the first time. She had looked at it before, of course, dozens of times, but always as background. The wall behind the shelf, the surface she was cleaning toward, the thing she would get to eventually. Now she looked at it as a thing in itself. The plaster was the same age and color as the rest of the pantry, the same fine craze of hairline cracks running across its surface. Nothing about it announced itself as different. But the shelf unit she had just moved was heavier than the others had been. She had assumed that was the wood, old oak gone dense with age. Now she looked at the shelf's mounting brackets and saw that they were set not into the plaster, but into a wooden frame behind it, a frame whose edges, when she ran her fingers along the wall's right side, she could feel as a seam beneath decades of paint. A door, plastered and painted over, its frame filled in so carefully that only the hollow sound gave it away. Someone had not merely closed this door. They had hidden it. She spent the rest of that afternoon finding its edges. She worked with a butter knife from the kitchen drawer, running it along the wall surface, feeling for the give that would confirm where plaster ended and frame began. It took 2 hours of slow, methodical work, the kind of work she had to stop and rest from every 20 minutes because her wrist could not sustain the pressure continuously. By 4 o'clock, she had traced a rectangle approximately 3 feet wide and 6.5 feet tall, its right edge running along the corner where the pantry met the exterior wall, its top hidden beneath the lowest shelf of the built-in cabinet above. Someone had constructed that cabinet specifically to cover the top of the door. The cabinet was not original to the room. The screw holes for its upper brackets went into wood, not plaster, and the wood they went into was newer than anything else in the pantry, its grain a different color where she scratched the paint away with her thumbnail. The door had been concealed deliberately and with considerable effort, and the concealment had been built to last. She did not try to open it that evening. It was getting dark, and she had learned in 18 days of living at Crane House that doing anything unfamiliar in the dark was a way to hurt herself, and she was 78 years old with no one to drive her to a hospital. She went back to the study, made tea, sat by the fire, and thought about what a hidden door in the pantry wall of an abandoned mansion might mean. She thought about it for a long time. She thought about what Leland had said years ago about the Farrow and Crane families sharing a history. She thought about the way the house had been stocked as though for a long-planned absence, the candles and the lanterns and the wool blankets in the cedar chest. She thought about the study's bookshelves, which she had been working through slowly, and the names she had seen inscribed in the front covers of several of the older volumes. Aldous Crane, in a hand that was precise and small and gave nothing away. Aldous Crane had lived in this house. Aldous Crane had hidden a door in his pantry wall, and at some point, Aldous Crane had left and not returned, and no one in Millhaven seemed to know why, or if they did, no one had talked about it in any way that had reached Odette in 46 years of living in the town. She slept poorly that night, which was unusual. The first 2 weeks had exhausted her thoroughly enough that sleep had not been a problem regardless of what she was thinking about. But she lay in her study bed and looked at the fire's last light moving on the ceiling and felt the particular restlessness of someone standing at the edge of something whose size they cannot yet determine. Morning came gray and cold, with frost on the back garden's dead grass. Odette made tea, ate 2 crackers, and went to the pantry with a butter knife and a claw hammer she had found in the carriage house toolbox. She began at the door's right edge, where the seam was clearest, and worked the knife into the gap until the plaster cracked and fell away in pieces, exposing the wooden frame beneath. Then she worked the hammer's claw behind the frame, gently, patient as she had always been patient, and pulled. The door moved. The door swung inward on hinges that had not moved in a very long time. The sound they made was low and grinding, metal oxide against metal, and Odette stopped after the first few inches and applied the butter knife to each hinge in turn, working a few drops of cooking oil she had brought from the kitchen into the joints before she continued. The door deserved that much. Whatever was behind it had waited this long. It could wait another 10 minutes. When it was fully open, she held the oil lantern up and looked. A staircase. Narrow, going down, its walls bare brick on both sides, the treads made of the same dark oak as the rest of the house's floors. The air that came up from below was cool and dry, which was not what she had expected. She had expected damp, the underground smell of water and soil. What she got instead was the same hell-breath stillness as the rest of the house, but concentrated, as though whatever had been preserved down there had been preserved more completely than anything above. She stood at the top of the stairs for a full minute before she descended. Not from fear, or not only from fear, but from the same caution that had kept her safe for 18 days in a house with uncertain floors and no one to help if something went wrong. She tested the first tread with her full weight before she trusted it. Then the second, then the third. The stairs held, solid and silent, and she went down slowly with the lantern raised and one hand trailing the brick wall beside her. There were 14 steps. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a room. It was not a cellar. A cellar was what she had been expecting. Stone floor, low ceiling, the utilitarian bones of a working house. This was something else. The ceiling was higher than the stairs had suggested, perhaps 9 feet, with plaster above the brick wainscoting that ran around its lower half. The floor was wide plank wood, the same oak as the stairs. 3 walls held built-in shelving from floor to ceiling, and the shelves held more books than Odette had seen outside a library in 30 years of working in one. In the room's center stood a desk. It was a large desk, partner style, with a leather surface gone dry and cracked with age. 2 oil lamps sat on it, unlit, a pen in a stand, an inkwell, long dry, a blotter, and on the left side of the desk, squared up with its edge as though placed there to be found, a wooden box roughly the size of a shoebox, its lid fitted with a small brass latch. Odette set her lantern on the desk and lit the 2 oil lamps from its flame. The room came up in warm, amber light. The books on the shelves were old, many of them, their spines faded, their titles in the small, careful hand she recognized from the inscriptions upstairs. Aldous Crane had built this room and filled it and used it, and then he had sealed it from the inside somehow, or had someone seal it after him, and the house above had gone on standing for 30 years with this underneath it, and no one had known. She sat in the desk chair, which creaked but held, and opened the wooden box. Inside, on top, was a letter. 2 pages, handwritten in the same small, precise script, dated September 1987. Below the letter, a folded document, official in its weight and formatting, with a county seal pressed into its upper corner. Below that, more papers, a small stack of them, held together with a rusted clip. She read the letter first. It was addressed to no one by name. It began, "If you have found this room, you were meant to. The house knows who belongs in it." Aldous Crane had written the letter in the last weeks of his life, in the autumn of 1987, when he was 81 years old and had been told by his doctor that he had perhaps 2 months remaining. He had no children. His wife had died in 1971. His closest living relatives, he wrote, were the Farrows of Millhaven, descended from his mother's sister, and it was to a Farrow that he had always intended Crane House to pass. He had written a will to that effect in 1979. The will had been filed with a Millhaven attorney named Gideon Price, who had died in 1991, and whose practice had dissolved without, it appeared, anyone ensuring its records were properly transferred or preserved. The document beneath the letter was a deed. The deed conveyed Crane House and its property, 42 acres in total, to the eldest living Farrow descendant, to be determined at the time of discovery. Odette sat in the amber light of Aldous Crane's underground study and read the deed 3 times. Then she set it down on the leather surface of the desk and sat very still with her hands in her lap. She was the last Farrow in Millhaven. She was the only one left. She sat at Aldous Crane's desk for a long time after that. The oil lamps burned steadily. The books on their shelves held their silence. Outside, above the sealed ceiling of this underground room, the November wind moved through the oaks in the Crane House drive, and the town of Millhaven went about its morning, entirely unaware that a 78-year-old woman who had been evicted from her home 3 weeks ago was sitting 40 feet away beneath a pantry floor reading a deed that named her the rightful owner of the property she had been sleeping in. She was not a person given to dramatic internal speeches. She had not composed one now. What she did instead was read the deed a 4th time, slowly, checking each clause against her understanding of what legal documents meant, which was limited but not non-existent. 30 years as a librarian had included a great many patrons researching property law, estate law, inheritance disputes, and she had helped enough of them find enough documents that she had absorbed more than a layperson's share of how these things worked. The deed was real. The language was correct. The county seal was pressed into the paper with the particular depth of an official instrument, not a copy. Aldous Crane had executed this document in the presence of 2 witnesses whose signatures appeared at the bottom alongside his, and the date of execution was March 14th, 1979. What it needed was a lawyer. She climbed back up the 14 stairs, pulled the pantry door gently to behind her, and went to the study to think. The problem was not the deed's validity, which she believed was sound. The problem was that 45 years had passed since its execution. The attorney who had filed the original will was dead. His practice's records were gone. The deed itself had been sitting in a wooden box in a sealed underground room, unknown to anyone, while the house above it had stood empty and its legal ownership had presumably sat in some county records office in a state of quiet uncertainty for 3 decades. Untangling that would require someone who knew property law in Virginia, and someone who knew property law in Virginia would cost money she did not have. She spent 2 days thinking through this before she made the call. Cecilia Marsh, the neighbor from Sycamore Lane who had pressed $300 into her hand on the morning of the eviction, had a daughter named Nessa Blum who worked for the Millhaven Courier. Odette had known Nessa since she was 9 years old, had watched her grow up through the library's summer reading programs, had written her a reference letter when she applied to journalism school 15 years ago. Nessa was 34 now, careful and sharp, and, more to the point, the kind of person who understood that some stories mattered beyond their immediate news value. Odette called Cecilia's number from the kitchen's wall phone, which she had discovered still held a dial tone, and asked Cecilia to pass a message to Nessa. Just that Odette was all right, and that she had something Nessa might want to hear, and that she should come alone to the Crane House drive on Thursday morning at 9. Nessa came at 8:45. She stood in the entrance hall of Crane House and turned in a slow circle, taking in the clean floors, the rehung drapes, the neatly stacked firewood visible through the study door, and the small, composed woman standing in the middle of it all in a worn coat with her white hair pinned up, and her expression cycled through surprise and confusion before it settled into something that looked like recognition. "You have been living here," Nessa said. It was not quite a question. "For 3 weeks," Odette said. "Come and see what I found." She took Nessa down the 14 stairs with the lantern raised, the same way she had gone herself, and watched Nessa's face when the underground study came up in the amber lamplight. She gave her the letter and the deed and stood back while she read them, which Nessa did twice without speaking. Then Nessa looked up and said, very quietly, "Does no one know about any of this?" "No," Odette said. "Does anyone?" "You," Odette said. "And now me." "And Aldous Crane, who has been dead for 35 years. Nessa set the deed down on the leather surface of the desk with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something she has just understood the weight of. Then she took out her phone and called a number from memory. Odette listened to one side of a conversation that lasted 4 minutes and ended with Nessa saying the name Callum Hurst and an address and a time the following morning. She hung up and looked at Odette. "He does elder law and property disputes," Nessa said. "He owes me a favor that is significantly larger than a phone call, which means he will take this on contingency without asking questions until he has seen the documents himself. He will ask questions after, but by then it won't matter." Odette nodded once. "Good," she said. Callum Hurst was 51 years old. With reading glasses, he kept losing an illegal mind that Nessa had described as the sharpest in the county and also the least impressed by its own sharpness, which Odette took as a good sign. He came to Crane House the following morning with a document case and spent 2 hours in the underground study reading everything in the wooden box, photographing each page with his phone, and saying very little. Odette made tea upstairs and waited. She had spent a lifetime waiting for things to resolve themselves at their own pace, and she was not about to stop now. When he came back up the 14 stairs, he set his document case on the kitchen table and looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "The deed is valid," he said. "The execution is clean. The witnesses were notarized separately in a document I found beneath the others, and the county's property records show Crane House has been in an unresolved estate status since 1992, which means no one has had clear legal title to it for 33 years. Your family connection to Aldous Crane can be established through the county birth records, which I will pull this week." He paused. "Nolan's sale of your Sycamore Lane property is a separate matter, but the power of attorney he used had a clause limiting its scope to properties you personally owned at the time of signing. A competent argument can be made that he exceeded that scope. I would like to make that argument." Odette looked at him steadily. "How long will it take?" "For the deed, months. For Nolan, longer." He picked up his document case. "I will need you to stay available and to stop worrying about the cost. Nessa told me what happened to you. This is the kind of work I do because it needs doing." He left. Odette stood in the kitchen for a while after he was gone, listening to the house. Nessa's article ran in the Millhaven Courier 4 days later. It was careful and specific in the way that good journalism is careful and specific, naming what had happened without editorializing beyond what the facts required. Odette Farrow, 78, retired librarian, 46 years on Sycamore Lane. The power of attorney, the sale, the eviction, the walk to Crane House, the 3 weeks of living inside alone, the hidden staircase, the underground study, the deed. Nessa had written it the way Odette had asked her to write it, not as a victim's story, but as the account of a woman who had found something that belonged to her because she had been the only one paying attention. The regional papers picked it up within 48 hours. By the end of the week, it had reached the state level. By the following Monday, Odette's phone, which she had kept charged on the kitchen's 2-burner unit, had received more messages than she could count, from people she hadn't spoken to in years and people she had never met at all. Nolan did not call. She had carried every book from the underground study upstairs to the sitting room shelves, handling each volume with the care 30 years of library work had made automatic. Aldous Crane's collection ran to nearly 400 books. History, mostly in natural science, with a substantial section on Virginia land law that she found she was reading with more interest than she would have predicted. In the evenings, she sat by the study fire with tea and read, or wrote letters to the people who had written to her after Nessa's article, or simply sat in the quiet of the house with the fire's light on the walls and the sound of the old structure settling around her. One evening in late March, Nessa came for dinner, which by then was a real dinner made on a proper stove that had been installed in the kitchen by a plumber who had read the article and offered his labor for cost. They ate soup and bread at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing, the way people talk when they are comfortable enough with each other to let the conversation go where it wants. At some point, Nessa asked her whether she missed Sycamore Lane. Odette thought about it honestly before she answered, the way she tried to think about everything honestly. The house on Sycamore Lane had been where she and Leland had built their life, and she would carry that with her regardless of where she lived. The garden there, the porch, the kitchen where she had cooked 10,000 meals. Those were not gone because the house was gone. They were in her, permanently, the way 43 years of marriage was in her, and 30 years of library work was in her, and every book she had ever read was in her. A house could be taken. What you had made inside it could not. Crane House was something different. She had not built her life here with someone she loved. She had built it alone, out of necessity, in the hardest months she could remember since Leland died. She had carried wood and cleaned rooms and run a butter knife along a plaster wall and descended 14 stairs by oil lamp into something no one had seen in 35 years. She had done all of it at 78 years old with a bad shoulder and $300 and the same stubbornness that had carried her through every difficult thing before this one. This house was not where her life had been. It was where she had proven, to no audience but herself, that her life was not finished. That was worth more than any address on any street in any town. No, she told Nessa. She did not miss Sycamore Lane. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. They finished dinner. Nessa left. Odette washed the bowls and set them to dry and turned off the kitchen light and walked through the dark entrance hall to the study where the fire was burning low and the shelves held Aldous Crane's 400 books and the oil lamp on the desk gave off its steady amber circle. She added 2 pieces of oak to the fire. She sat in her chair. She picked up her book. Outside, the March wind moved through the oaks in the long drive, and Crane House stood solid and lit against the dark, the way it had stood for 130 years, the way it would go on standing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.